Sterkfontein Cave Incident. It was September 29, 1984. A cave explorer named Nuno Gomes was exploring unmapped sections of the Sterkfontein cave in South Africa. He was accompanied by his two friends, Peter Verhulsel and Malcolm, and together they planned to lay a guideline from the entrance to the farthest point of the wet cave area known as Milner Hall. The plan was for Nuno to go in and place the guideline, while Peter and Malcolm waited outside, assisting him from the surface. Nuno plunged into the water and successfully laid the line, covering a distance of 396 feet from the entrance to the end. Happy because of the success, the three decided to go back in and follow the new guideline. Once they reached the air pocket at the end, they were satisfied that they had successfully mapped this cave section, so they turned around and began to head out, following the line. As Nuno led the group, he suddenly felt Malcolm touch him. Malcolm was signaling that Peter was no longer behind them. Nuno went back to see where Peter had gone and noticed that he had entered a side tunnel. Nuno tapped Peter to get his attention and signaled him to return to the guideline and exit the cave. As they headed back, however, Peter disappeared again. This time, Nuno and Malcolm assumed he had taken the other exit, avoiding the tight squeeze they themselves used, so they did not go back to look for him. When Nuno and Malcolm surfaced and realized Peter was not there and still hadn't come out after a while, they submerged once more to look for him. They searched along the guideline and even in the side tunnels, but there was no sign of him. After 4 long hours, they ran out of air tanks, and the stirred-up silt reduced visibility to almost nothing. Finally, late that afternoon, they exited the cave and called for help. The fire brigade arrived, but lacking cave diving expertise, had to wait for the police divers to continue the search in the evening. The silt was so stirred up that visibility was heavily impaired. The police called off the search for the night, convinced they would now be searching for a body rather than a survivor. What no one realized was that Peter was not dead at all. He had been sidetracked by a secondary tunnel, and the cave's complex 3D structure, combined with the lack of a guideline, the stirred-up silt, and the darkness, made it nearly impossible for him to orient himself. After trying many possible paths, Peter found a small room and decided to wait there for rescuers. He shone his light into the water in hopes of signaling his friends, but when no one came for a long time, he switched it off to conserve the little battery life remaining. He tried making noise by banging his tank on the rocks, but to no avail. Eventually, he became exhausted, fell asleep, and lost track of time. After that first night of searching, the police closed off the cave so no one else could enter. Unfortunately, the silt took a long time to settle, so visibility remained poor. Convinced Peter had not survived, the police decided to wait a full week before resuming the search. On October 6th, 7 days after Peter's disappearance, they returned but found no sign of him. Another week passed before they tried again, but he was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, Peter was still alive. He had spent 14 days in complete darkness, starving and having lost much of his weight. Hoping for a way out, he decided to follow a passage leading from the small room where he had sheltered. After traveling 120 feet away from the water, he discovered it was only a dead end, so he returned to his spot near the water to wait once more for rescuers. The police continued weekend searches for 6 weeks, but they never found him and finally called off the search with no result. At that point, they reopened the dry sections of the cave, but kept the water section closed. Volunteers then began looking for a connection between the dry and wet cave systems, and Nuno joined them. His contributions were crucial. He was the one who discovered the connection where they could enter the wet section of the cave. It was there that they found a set of footprints leading to a dead end, and soon after, Peter's body. Beside his body was a message that read, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." It was later discovered that one diver had come really close to finding him, as he entered an opening that was just 100 feet away from Peter's location. The autopsy revealed that he died of starvation after 3 weeks in the cave. Although we may criticize Peter's decision to explore on his own, we should also respect the fact that he fought to survive until the very end. Crooked Swamp Incident. It was March 27, 1982, and Donald Weltner, along with his two sons Christopher and Roger, were about to lead a group of 12 Boy Scouts on a day of cave exploration. This wasn't Donald's first time caving, and even though the passages in the Crooked Swamp cave system were notoriously narrow, he wasn't too concerned. Donald was bigger than the other participants, so if he could get through, the rest of the group could too. At 2 o'clock, they entered the cave through its 16 by 28-inch entrance and stopped in a room inside. Donald was on the eastern side and noticed several smaller tunnels leading from the room. However, because they weren't sure which passages would be too narrow, Donald decided to check one. It involved a tight squeeze but appeared to open to another section, so he tried to push through. The squeeze measured 18 by 20 inches, so tight that he couldn't move his arms backward or lift his head to see ahead. He was followed by his sons, and while moving forward thanks to the mud, making the terrain slippery, he reported back to them what was happening. Everything seemed normal until something unexpected occurred. As he pulled himself along, he realized the ground below him was disappearing. Donald slipped down into a tight crevice, and the slick mud prevented him from stopping his slide. His hands were trapped, leaving him no leverage to pull himself up. Making matters worse, the path angled about 30 degrees, so he had to fight against gravity. The crevice was just 5 inches wide, and the slippery mud caused his body to settle more and more. He told his sons to pull on his feet, but after several failed attempts, he told them to get the other adult in the cave, Jim. After a while, Jim also realized they wouldn't be able to free Donald on their own. Donald explained that some rocks had loosened when he slid and were now wedging against his body. Each time they tried to pull him backward, the loose rocks would slide forward and block the passage. Jim exited the cave to call for help. Cave rescue specialists and the police arrived, and because only one person could squeeze into that narrow space at a time, they tried using ropes to free Donald. This didn't work either, so they brought in tools to try breaking some of the rocks. However, given how tight the space was, hours of work led to only small breakthroughs, and Donald's situation grew worse. He was thirsty, hungry, and in a very cold environment, so hypothermia was a major concern. The cavers considered entering from the other side to give Donald food and water, but they found that the passage leading to where he laid was extremely narrow. Only 2 very small cavers, sisters Lynn and Nancy Taylor, were able to fit, but even then, they couldn't reach Donald's head. This meant there was no way of delivering supplies, so rescuers had to act quickly. They decided to dig from above ground, down to where Donald was stuck. The process lasted all day Sunday, getting them close to the required depth. Unfortunately, though, they were about 12 feet away from Donald's position, so they needed to dig laterally. Meanwhile, Donald began giving only grunting responses, which indicated he was likely suffering from hypothermia. On Monday morning, as 2 days passed from when he got stuck, the digging continued, but the team encountered another problem: extremely hard bedrock layers that were impossible to dig through. At this point, they weren't sure if Donald was still alive, so they sent a nurse into the cave with a handheld Doppler machine to see if he still had a pulse. She couldn't detect one, but this wasn't definitive proof of death, since she only had access to his very cold legs. Sometimes, the body's core organs can continue functioning after the extremities have stopped registering a pulse. Seeing how quickly Donald's condition was deteriorating, rescuers started using their most extreme tools, including dynamite, which was extremely risky but appeared to be the only option left. On Tuesday morning, they finally managed to reach his location, and a doctor was sent in immediately, but as many feared, Donald had died. It took an entire day to retrieve his body, and an autopsy later confirmed he had succumbed to hypothermia sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning. Following his death, the cave system was restricted to limited access. Agen Allwedd incident. Roger Solari and Martin Farr, aged 26 and 23 respectively, wanted to map out the Agen Allwedd cave system in South Wales. At the time, John Parker, another explorer, had abandoned the mission after discovering a third sump in one of its longest passages. Martin and Roger, however, wanted to keep going to see what lay beyond. The first trip was done by Martin alone, because Roger had hurt his knee, making it extremely dangerous for Martin to continue solo. Reaching the third sump was a feat in itself, since the route was not only tortuous, but also extremely long, lasting for hours, as the first sump was about a mile into the cave. The first 2 sumps measured only 249 feet and 82 feet, so Martin passed through them relatively easily. However, the third sump was much longer, and nobody had fully explored it yet, so Martin could only hope he had enough air to reach the end. Fortunately, he managed to swim through it, about 850 feet, and on the other side he found something else interesting, a zigzagging passage roughly 1,800 feet long, leading to another sump. Nobody had known about this 4th sump, and Martin realized he probably wouldn't have enough air to explore it and then return. He spent the next 4 to 5 hours heading back out, planning to wait for Roger so they could tackle sump 4 together on the next trip. When they returned on June 15, 1974, both Roger and Martin brought extra air tanks. They successfully reached sump 4 and began diving it with a guideline to help map the route. After about 400 feet, Roger finished his guideline, and he had sinus problems, even though it wasn't the first time. Despite this, they decided to continue. Martin then took out his own guideline and they kept going, but they made an important mistake. In cave diving, there is a concept called the rule of thirds for air consumption. If you use 1/3 of your air supply on the way in, you need another third to get out, leaving the final third as an emergency reserve. They had already used their first third and should have turned back when Roger's line ran out. Because Roger had a smaller tank than Martin assumed Roger would head out while he continued forward. He eventually came to a gravel wall of rock, which could have indicated the sump was ending, and possibly an air pocket. By this point, he was well past the halfway mark of his tank, so it was becoming extremely risky. He pushed on until he reached solid rock, confirming there was no air pocket. Spotting a passage to the right, he explored another 29 feet, but it ended in a dead end. When he backtracked, he was shocked to see Roger still there. Martin quickly signaled that they had to return. Roger, likely realizing he didn't have enough air to make it back, back, attempted to locate the same air pocket Martin had been searching for. Martin continued about 130 feet until his main tank ran out, forcing him to switch to a reserve tank. That would give him only about 300 feet in sump 4 and another 850 feet in sump 3, barely enough. However, he had previously placed a partially filled tank between sump 3 and sump 2, and he aimed to reach that. Finally emerging from sump 4, Martin sat on the bank, waiting for Roger, who, remember, had a smaller tank. If he didn't appear soon, it would be a huge problem. After 20 minutes with no sign of Roger, Martin realized that if Roger had surfaced from sump 4 at that moment, he likely wouldn't have enough air left to get through sump 3. After an hour, Martin was certain Roger's air had run out. Martin entered the water again and tried pulling the guideline to make it tense, but it didn't. It was no longer connected. It had been cut at about the 430-foot mark. This was probably where Roger needed to change tanks. Because switching them wasn't a simple task at the time, he might have put his arm through the line to avoid losing it, twisted his body to reach the valve, and become tangled, forcing him to cut the line to move freely. This, combined with the silt kicked up by movement, likely reduced his visibility, and he may have swum the wrong way. At that point, there was no doubt Roger had exhausted his air. Martin stayed calm and managed to navigate the next 3 sumps safely. He alerted the authorities immediately, and the search for Roger's body began. Martin himself joined the search, along with many others. However, Roger's remains were not found until 1986, 12 years later. Recovering the body was deemed too risky, so it was left in the cave, and a plaque was placed near the entrance of Sump 1, in Roger's honor. In 1987, another explorer passed through Sump 4 and finally located the air pocket, 875 feet in, the very one Roger and Martin had hoped to find. It was called the Against All Odds Chamber. Martin stated that after this incident, he never broke the rule of thirds again. He went on to have a remarkable diving career. Today, the entrance to the cave system is locked, and only specific, experienced divers are granted a key. Floyd Collins Incident. In late December 1924, Floyd Collins discovered a cave called Sand Cave, which was easily accessible to tourists because it was near a highway. He quickly struck a deal with the land's owners to receive 50% of any profits from the cave's exploration. Afterward, he immediately began working there. Since there was no significant entrance, however, many tourists avoided it. As a result, Floyd spent hours every day over the next few weeks digging deeper and deeper. On January 30th, 1925, it was snowing outside, and once again, Floyd went into the cave, only to find something shocking. Crawling forward with a lantern, he reached what was known as the turnaround room, called that way because many cavers would stop there and turn around, deeming it too risky to continue. The only way to go farther was through a tiny, narrow hole called the squeeze, which measured only 9 inches in height. Floyd, however, managed to push through. Beyond the squeeze, he saw a narrow pit dropping about 10 feet. He went down feet first and reached the bottom, where he found yet another pit. Squatting down, he removed the remaining rocks and debris and finally saw an opening into the main cave. He tied a rope in place and descended an 80-foot drop. Reaching the cavern floor, he was amazed by the sight, but noticed his light was starting to dim. Wanting to avoid being left in the dark, he climbed back up the 80-foot drop and began returning, moving backwards and pushing his lantern with his shoulder. Unfortunately, his lantern slipped into a tiny hole and shattered, leaving him in total darkness. Because the cavern was extremely unstable, Floyd knew he had to move carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks. Unable to see, however, he kicked one loose, and it fell onto his left leg, trapping him. He tried freeing himself with his right leg, but the more he moved, the more rocks tumbled down, further wedging him in place. It was 10 a.m., and he began shouting for help, hoping someone would hear him. He remained there all day, and by 9 a.m. the next morning, nearly 24 hours after he had become trapped, 2 of the cave's owners arrived with their 17-year-old son, Jewel Estes, to check on him. They saw Floyd's coat hanging outside the cave and called his name, but no one answered, so they ventured deeper. Before long, the 2 owners turned back because the passages were too tight, but Jewel continued and eventually found Floyd, who asked him to call his brothers for help. Soon, Marshall Collins, Floyd's brother, and Lee Collins, Floyd's father, reached the entrance, finding a growing crowd watching the rescue attempt. Marshall and another man went inside to widen the passage, digging carefully so as not to send loose rocks tumbling onto Floyd. At 4 p.m., Floyd's other brother Homer arrived. Floyd had previously asked Homer to come along that day, so Homer felt guilty for refusing and did his best to help. He did reach Floyd, but a new problem emerged. The crowds outside had started multiple bonfires. The melting ice funneled water into the cave, creating mud and sending freezing cold water down toward Floyd. After 8 hours with Floyd, his brothers had to rest. Upon emerging, Homer grew furious at the huge crowd, telling people to leave if they couldn't help. However, none of them listened. Reporters began arriving, hoping to interview Homer. Tired of the questions, he told them to see for themselves inside the cave. Confusion and rumors spread. Some claimed Floyd was already dead or that the cave had collapsed entirely. Determined to prove otherwise, Marshall offered a $500,000 reward to anyone who saved his brother. As rumors spread more, however, he went in to check on Floyd himself and found him alive. Floyd managed to free one hand, suggesting they tie a rope around his chest to pull him out, but as soon as they tried, he begged them to stop, saying he felt like he was being pulled in two. Homer worked continuously, removing dirt and debris until he was utterly exhausted and needed medical attention. By Tuesday night, 95 hours after Floyd had become trapped, a reporter named Skeets entered the cave and installed a light bulb near Floyd. While removing rubble, Skeets exposed more of Floyd's legs, but still couldn't free him. His story and interview with Floyd were published, drawing even larger crowds. Hotels nearby were filled, and at least 1,000 people gathered around Sand Cave. All this activity further weakened the cave walls, putting it at risk of collapse, though nobody realized it at the time, as everyone was rooting for Floyd. At hour 123, the entrance to the pit collapsed, blocking any access to Floyd and cutting off deliveries of food and water. By hour 144, a team of workers formed to dig a new tunnel to reach him. The only way they could know if Floyd was still alive was the light bulb Skeets had installed. It was connected to another bulb outside, which would flicker when Floyd breathed. They dug relentlessly, but with no food or water reaching Floyd, combined with the cold temperature, his chances were fading quickly. By Friday, February 13th, the men had nearly reached him, and one worker reported hearing groaning about 10 feet away. However, at 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, a worker reached Floyd and found him already deceased. Initially, Floyd's body was left in the cave. After some time, though, his brother Homer arranged for its removal and gave him a proper burial. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.